the Within Orb podcast. Come get Within Orb. Hello, my name is Jenn Zart, and welcome to Within Orb, a production of the Celestial Arts Education Library, a podcast bringing people together around the love of astrology, books. Join me as I interview people about the astrology books that changed their life and practice. You can support the podcast at withinorb.com. Welcome to another episode of Within Orb, and we are heading south to the Bay Area to hang out with Drew Levanti. Welcome to the show.
Hi, Jen. Thanks for having me. I feel like I am within at least a few degrees of orb with you being here on the West Coast.
Oh, absolutely. And you're also hanging out with the ghost of my past self who lived in Berkeley for 10 years. So
that is so cool. I love hopping over to the East Bay. And I'm also living in the ghost. I live on old cemetery grounds, which is interesting. Given that my IC ruler is Jupiter in Capricorn, I always find that funny. Mm-hmm. But also, I live across the street. No exaggeration, with across the street from the dorms of the university that Demetra George attended her first astrology conference at. And also where she met Rudyard. No, that's a lie. She met Rudyard in the East Bay the night of that conference, like when she went to stay with somebody, and was given the asteroid ephemeris at that conference too. So
wow. Yeah. And I'm sure we have a copy of that same ephemeris here at CAELi.
I bet you do. And what's so funny too is that this house that I moved into, you know how San Francisco is, like I moved in with like a master, like the person has had this apartment for a while and they like rent out rooms. They have an extensive astrological library.
Amazing.
Well, I mean, not extensive like CAELi, obviously. But,
but that's good. That's good. And, you know, a fun fact here, this building that CAELi is occupying was first used as a practice. What do we call it? It's not a smithery, but a place where they would begin to learn how to carve headstones for cemeteries.
Wow.
So when you dig around in the garden, you'll find these old practice chunks of headstones with various carvings on them.
That's so interesting. Yeah, I've always lived close to cemeteries, actually. It's like a recurring thing. I had the moon opposite Uranus. So I move a lot, but they are in fixed signs. So I tend, the situations often are similar. The Northwest is like my spiritual birthplace, even if it's not my physical birthplace. And this kind of gets to one of the books. Let the Great World Spin is about the Twin Towers, not their falling, but a tightrope walker who walked between them in 1974. And it's this beautiful, multiple narrative interweaving story about just all these different people and how their stories kind of intersect through this figure of the tightrope walker.
Wow.
And it was really impactful for me because I read it in high school in like AP Lit or whatever, having left the cult, coming back to Connecticut to live with my dad. I was born in Connecticut, but 9/11, I was 5 years old, and that was the event that precipitated my mom and me joining Jay-Z's thing in Washington.
Wow.
It was this like big full circle thing, and then ending up back in Washington for the conference. There's this whole like back and forth east-west thing has always been a part of my life. And I'll tell you, in terms of, I think you're into astrophotography a bit, right?
Absolutely.
So, you know, we make decisions about our lives. You know, as an electional astrologer, you would think like, oh, you plan all this shit out, right? And it's like, no, like you can do these things and you don't necessarily know what you're doing until you look back at it. And it's like, oh, that was the astrology. Cool. Like makes sense. So the specific place in Washington that I grew up in, like in Yelm, is the intersection of two lines. My Jupiter IC line, so I have Jupiter in Capricorn, and my Chiron ascendant line.
Wow.
Yeah.
Say no more, honestly.
Yeah, go figure. But guess where that Jupiter IC line continues to?
Waco.
Oh my God. Thank God I don't have to live in Texas. No offense to Texas.
Oh, wait. No. You're going to say San Francisco.
The Bay. It's like literally through the Bay. And I had no idea before I moved here. But it's just interesting to have all these synchronicities with like Demetra and like, you know, she's been following my Orphism stuff and like having all of this research about like the ancients, scare quotes on that, with Jupiter and Capricorn being my line here. And so there's this way in which I feel like I'm still trying to figure out like what is that central scene, like the tightrope walker, what is that scene in my life that I have all of these different vantage points from? It's like I get to inhabit all of these different characters in different places, or it almost feels like my life is its own myth to some extent. And I have talked to other people about having this experience. It definitely comes up, especially with like when I fall in love, there's this kind of sense of like living a myth, you know?
Yeah. Well, I also like that image, you might be drawing it intentionally or unintentionally, but this Drew as the tightrope walker from Connecticut to Washington and back and back. And, I know they've done a documentary about this. I think it's Man on Wire or something, I believe.
Yeah.
And there is no back and forth in that walk. No apparatus, by the way, just a nice pole and 2 feet on a wire. So, very brave.
Yeah.
And so to see all of your peregrinations across the United States as like drawing your own wire.
Wow.
Back and forth.
That's brilliant. Thank you. Yeah. And like I moved here to San Francisco from Chicago, which is like in the middle and sort of like in a certain way, like the heart of the country, and like has this very specific relationship with westward expansion. And yeah, I love that image that you're drawing about like the tightrope. And I think he probably wrote this book about that event sort of about / not about 9/11, because
Right.
it is one of those sort of like things that we all looked at from different places,
Yeah. Well, and it brings in the Gemini archetype as well, because what was happening in the mundane astrology of that day was Saturn opposing Pluto from Gemini-Sag axis. So yeah, I mean, I already knew something was going to happen before it happened, just as being an astrologer, looking at that, going like, okay, this is not a small aspect in the sky right now.
For sure.
But I had no idea it would take that shape, although some astrologers did.
Yeah.
Nevertheless, so we've skipped ahead to the first book you'd take with you, but let's go back to, just for a moment, what was your first astrology book?
Honestly, I think the Brennan book was. Yeah, believe it or not, because he and I were talking about this the other day, where like when y'all learned astrology, you probably learned modern first, and then like traditional was later. I don't know where Uranian and German stuff fits into it for you, but basically I am part of this new crop of folks who learned. I guess I didn't learn traditional first. I kind of like got Chris's book at the same time that I was watching like every YouTube video I could find, which was all modern. So yeah, that was my first book in 2017.
I mean, that's a pretty heavy place to begin.
Yeah, but I was at school at U Chicago, so it seemed kind of like, well, I don't know if this is scholarly enough. Like, I'm kidding.
Yeah, right? Like, if you're from University of Chicago and you're starting astrology, you begin with Chris Brennan's Hellenistic astrology. Like, throw the gauntlet down, jump in the deep end.
And astrology really was that deep dive, and I think that's what gripped me about Chris's book, was that it wasn't just, this sign means this, and this sign means this, and here's how you read it. Like, the history and the cultural context and imagining the world in which astrology was practiced was very resonant for me as somebody who was studying anthropology in college.
Yeah, and bypassing the ways that capitalism deforms astrology into a book product.
Ooh, tea.
Yeah, that's there. It's here too.
It's all around us.
Imagine stepping into a room of 5,000 astrology books, turning a corner and stepping into a room of 2,000 more. The Celestial Arts Education Library is every astrologer's dream, and it can be yours. I invite you to come support CAELi before you can visit physically. Your support will mean the creation of 52 new episodes of Within Orb next year, 4 issues of the CAELi Review, our inaugural journal, and countless book talks, events, classes for our community. Visit our website, www.caeli.institute/support, to select your level of care. Please help support CAELi into the future, our future, so that we may study the future together. Thank you for listening. Please enjoy the rest of the show. So, we just learned about a book you'd bring on your peregrinations around the country, and then we rewound to your first astrology book. So let's fast forward to your second book you'd take with you as you make your way around our lovely nation.
I have to admit that I have no idea what the word peregrination means, but I assume it has something to do with like not being at home.
What is a peregrine planet?
Well, exactly. That's what I'm like. Yeah, the context clues, like I get it, but okay, so I just haven't heard that word before now, and I'm enlightened in your presence, Jen. My next book, speaking of enlightenment, but also totally not, is The Presocratic Philosophers, which is a book by G.S. Kirk, J.E. Raven, and M. Schofield. And this book is a cursory tour de force of a number of pre-Socratic philosophers, including Thales, Anaximander, Anaximenes, Xenophanes, Heraclitus, who's one of my faves, Pythagoras, Parmenides, Zeno of Zeno as in Zeno's paradox of like the arrow, that like where is it actually, or like is it ever in between positions, or that whole thing. Empedocles, also one of my faves, originator of the fourfold element scheme. And so this is the first book that ever, I only got it like a few months ago actually, and it's really propelled my research into Orphism. And it's hard to describe the feeling that I got when I held this book for the first time. You know what I'm talking about.
But try. And then comes 300 lines of poetry. This is very classic in the tradition.
Right. It felt like I was being grabbed by a chorus of ancestors who may or may not be my blood, like it was like there were things in this book that I needed to know, and that maybe I did know at some point, but that I needed to know now to do what I need to do. It was very much like a loosing of the bond kind of thing, if you will.
I love that.
Yeah. And so one of the things that it's helped me explore is this sort of foundational discourse before, the birth of horoscopes and the sort of technical structures that we associate with astrology, but these sort of speculations about like what is the original substance or matter of the universe. And so this is often understood in terms of like, what is the arche? Like, and that's the name of my practice. Like, what is the first stuff? What is the primary form of matter from which everything else comes? And so like different philosophers have views about what it is. Some said it was air, some said it was fire, some said it was ether, some said it was, and then Empedocles comes along. He's like, there's 4 of them, and they actually just mix. And Empedocles has like love and strife, and love is like what keeps them. Strife is what mixes them, and then love is what kind of brings them together. So all of that has really enlivened my sense of the elements as like supra deities or something like that, and imagining. Like, for example, Empedocles just says that Zeus is fire, like Persephone is water, and Hades is earth, which like duh, like it's literally right there. And so all of like just there's something very simple and elegant about all of these pre-Socratic thinkers. And if you want to get to like a pre-capitalist way of thinking, like and just this kind of way of witnessing the world as it appears to us, and making theories or making stories, making myths about how it has come to be, that it feels very close to the source, I guess is what I'm trying to say.
That makes me want to read it.
Yeah, it's really cool. I mean, so what's nice about it is that first of all, it gives you the Greek, but it's not laborious if you don't know the Greek, because it then gives you the translation, and then it gives you commentary. So it's a pretty easy read, even though it's like relatively dense, just to like, it's one of those things where you have to spend a little time with each sentence and be like, okay, got it. Okay, got it. Really awesome. And like I can see so many ways in which their thought, and I'm seeing more and more ways in which their thought was foundational for what we do today.
Right.
But a lot of times we just stop at Plato, and it's like, well, Plato had influences too.
Yes, exactly. Yeah. And I like that idea of, it seems like by reading about the proposal of one element being the primary and then another, and then coming to this, realization that it's all of them mixing in different proportion.
Mm-hmm. Right. That's the word. That's the word.
I feel like that's a really cool meditation to take if we're so steeped in this more modern vantage point of star stuff, and, maybe have sealed off what we think fire is. And it's like, well, what did the pre-Socratics think fire was? Where are these elements really stemming from?
Mm-hmm. It's fascinating.
Does it make you write poetry?
It does. It really does.
Awesome.
I actually, how did you know?
I just felt it. I was like, wow, what I would do if I was doing this is the next thing I would put the book down and I'd probably write a bunch of poetry.
Well, that's the crazy thing, Jen, is that I wrote the poems before I found the book. Things get in there. And I think this is one of the really amazing things for me about working with Kristen, is that like I've read her translations, and like within that there's like, she knows the philosophy. And so she reads the Greek, and then she's like, it's in there. And then I'll kind of write something that's like riffing on the ideas, but also inspired by like falling in love or these sort of very archetypal experiences and these like mythic experiences that I'm having with my lover of like, I feel there's like a layer of reality, and I don't want to say it's above or below, right? It's both. It feels like it's the world axis, and I can reach out from it at any place, like from a tree root or like on a lightning bolt, where from what point on the lightning bolt is it going to like jolt out? Like it could be anywhere. And there is this sort of core experience that I'm both like coming into and out of all at the same time. And it sounds like I do a lot of psychedelics, which I don't. I do some. But
No, you do poetry. And I think that's the power of poetry, is you get to this perceptual like omnipresence.
Yeah. Ooh.
That's what I heard you describe.
For sure. And it's beautiful. And that's all it's supposed to be. We get into all of these knots about how we do things and why we do things, and we forget that we're just doing things. And that's sometimes good enough, and to let the silence just fill us. So yeah, thank you for bringing me to this place of getting to talk about it.
I resonate with your experience in my own ways, and it is pretty awesome to get to that point through whatever means. But I think having a relationship with the poetic elements of the transmission, and also transmitting yourself, taking time to say, no one has to read what I write next, but I just have to also translate my experience from world, my lover, my reading of the Presocratics into some kind of poem, and having the permission to just do it without the panopticon seeing you know what I mean? Like, just do it anyway. And
or no, but this is where the mystery element of it comes in. Like, look at me, panopticon, because you won't see it if you're not supposed to. Like, you won't see me if you're not supposed to.
Wow.
Yeah.
So, what would be the third book you'd take with you on this journey?
Well, Jen, speaking of journeys, I would take a book that has funnily traced a lot of the journeys that I've taken myself, but not by me. And that is American Afterlives by Shannon Lee Dawdy. She was my thesis advisor in college, and she was writing the book when she was advising my thesis, but I didn't get to read it until after. And the book is basically about how Americans are practicing, I'm putting that in scare quotes because it's like an academic term, like practicing death in the 21st century, especially paying attention to how 9/11, back to our conversation, how 9/11 transformed ideologies around death at a subtle level, ideologically, but at a material level, very empirically. So you have a lot more interest in like slow decomposition these days. You see a lot less cremation. There's a lot more cognizance around environmental effects of cremation with pollution and things like that. So one of the things that I found really inspiring about this book, in terms of, like I said, tracing journeys that I've taken, is that Shannon has lived in Chicago for a long time. She did a lot of the field work for this anthropology of death in Chicago, in New Orleans, and in the Bay Area, because originally she's actually from Guerneville. And she tells stories about being a little girl growing up next to a cemetery in Guerneville, which is north of San Francisco. Funnily enough, these days, Guerneville is too expensive for a lot of Shannon's friends from childhood to live in, because a lot of people like me from San Francisco use Guerneville as like their vacation place. So there's a lot of gay events up there, and, floating along the river and inner tubes and having a gay old time. But Shannon is so inspiring to me for the way that she's really rooted in place. And this is a thing that I think a lot of anthropologists are really good about, is just being really connected and really slow in building connections to place, building the relationships with people over time and building a lot of trust. And for me, as somebody who, like a lot of people these days, you could consider me like, I'm on the road right now. I'm in Chicago. I'm working from home, but like home is anywhere. I'm a digital nomad, all of that. But I am also not a digital nomad, like there are places that are really important to me and places that I have a relationship with and that I keep a relationship with over time. And so I think that there's a resistance in Shannon's book and her work in general to this sort of airy connection to place, as if we could be anywhere and nowhere. And I think it's really important for our species to remember that our feet are always on the ground, in this age of air that we've entered with the great conjunctions moving into air signs and Pluto in Aquarius for the next 30 years and all of those things that we've been talking about as astrologers recently. The era can change and, we are still very embodied beings, and new cycles, new triplicities will come upon us, and we will still have bodies and we will still have these decisions about what to do with our bodies, both alive and dead.
This temporal limit forcing consideration around, it's almost that other deeper philosophy of like, learn how to die to learn how to live.
Completely. Yeah. And I mean, it's like gets kind of back to the pre-Socratic ideas about coming apart and coming together and union and death and life being wholes that are whole, that are also not whole. That's sort of the language that the pre-Socratics use, that things are both whole and not whole. Well, I guess that's Heraclitus. And then you have Parmenides saying that everything just is. There is no not being. It's like death is not a not being. Death just is a being. And it's almost cliche to say death is a part of life, but it is. And the ways that we treat death, I mean, this has actually been a part of my work for some years now, is just thinking about death. I gave a talk. I was giving a series of talks about Saturn and thinking about Saturn as like an ecological figure. And when I moved to the Bay Area, I was doing this work on Saturn, and I was really inspired by the shell mounds in the Bay Area. Are you familiar with this, Jen?
Abstractly. Is the Albany bulb one of them?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
So the Albany bulb, I got an Airbnb for a week in between sublets when I first moved there, right next to the Albany bulb. And so for folks who don't know, the Albany bulb is in the East Bay. So it's like across the bay from San Francisco, sort of like north of Oakland, right off of Berkeley. And the Albany bulb is, I want to say it used to be it's like a former landfill that's been converted into like
it's like a temporary autonomous zone. There's all these artworks and
right. It's very psychedelic.
Public art. Yeah.
Yeah. Public art. And you got like inscriptions of like weird things that make you think about, like, am I in a simulation, but like more sophisticated than that. It's like the kind of stuff that if you were on psychedelics and you read them, it would be like, whoa, man.
Yeah.
Anyway. So yeah, the Albany bulb, I'm not sure if that was a shell mound, but basically the shell mounds were sites of spiritual significance, and I suppose you could call all sites of spiritual significance for the indigenous people of the Bay Area, who are called the Ohlone, and the Ohlone is the name of the language that they speak. And what was so fascinating to me about, in terms of contemplating death and the ways that death is a part of life, is that the shell mounds were burial sites, and they were the sites of celebration and eating. And so the way that the mounds formed was not only through burial, but also through life, through the discarding of the shells of the sea creatures that they would eat. And over time, just this slow accumulation of matter. And it rises and it erodes and it rises. And for me, that just spoke so clear, especially for me as somebody with Saturn in Pisces, where there's this very strong aquatic element of all of this. It really clearly showed how death can be a part of life, instead of, pushing everything out to a cemetery or burning the remains and sending the carbon into the atmosphere to, all around the world, just keeping things rooted in a place, keeping life and keeping death entwined in this local space that we can continue to have a relationship with because it's right here.
There's a beautiful paradox arising in your work as an electional astrologer who chooses beginnings and births, and the fascination of most astrology with the idea of the birth chart, and then that taboo subject of the death chart, which is actually the birth of your afterlife.
Right.
And this idea of the termination versus the inception.
Yeah, totally. I mean, there's just for folks for future reference, if you're interested in exploring this topic of death charts, there's a beautiful book by an astrologer named Moonrabbit. Do you know this book, Jen?
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah, Moonrabbit is a Twin Cities astrologer who I got to meet once. And yeah, I believe it was her sister's death that she was writing about, and she was exploring death charts. And it's just great to see that this taboo subject is getting explored. Probably not enough, but I appreciate you highlighting that for me, Jen, because I think it is something that, it's a path that is unfolding before me, especially through the Orphic stuff and all their interest in the afterlife.
Yeah. I mean, it's a full spectrum, right? Because if you are so deep in not just looking at inceptions, but choosing them, then also being really sensitive and aware of the endings of things versus the beginnings as well. And also the erasure between those two concepts of something starting, something ending, and whether or not that's actually real.
Right. As opposed to being the same body, just like kind of looked at from different vantage points.
Yeah. I mean, if you think about the idea of an afterlife of spirit that doesn't have an embodiment or becomes, alternatively embodied, and then the timelessness of time. Like if everything is eternity, but we're stuck as mortals in this perception of a three-dimensional reality with the fourth dimension of time, but really at a higher dimension, these things are fiction or fantasy or not necessarily what really is. It's like you begin this whole process of contemplation that dissolves the borders between death and life. And even in real terms, my own perception of death was shifted when my best friend was killed in Walnut Creek on the other side of the Berkeley Hills in a very freak cycling accident. And she donated her organs to someone who I still talk to this day.
Wow.
And when I met this person, I realized that what we think of as death is not what we commonly think of as death, as shown in the media, because the spirit of my friend is very much alive in her. She would be the donor, the donee. She's she's very much alive in this other person's body. And, usually with a double lung transplant, you have about 15 years and we're going on 18.
Wow.
So it's a pretty impressive story in and of itself, but just my closeness with the friend who passed, and then now my continued closeness with the person who's literally breathing because my friend is gone. It's been a pretty amazing seeing that distinction between life, death. Is my friend dead yet? Because she's got body parts that are still helping someone else stay alive, right? Like there's this whole illusion of what we consider to be a start and a stop to life.
Totally. Yeah. And now her spirit is also alive because the words of that person, the breath of that person have influenced you. And now you've influenced me and everybody else who's listening to this. And so it is like, it really does bring back this idea of just this Orphic idea of the all, and that, it is all one being. And to sort of demarcate beings with birth charts or with death charts and with beginnings and ends, it does make one wonder what we're doing as astrologers, or what could we be doing? Or like, what do these snapshots give us? What capacities do they give us to access that kind of higher layer of dimensionality, or perceiving the interconnections of these beings that we see as separate?
Or how much you is you, if people born near you, your time twins, or deeper time twins, as I call the secondary progressed time twins. So people born within a couple days or weeks of you.
Yeah.
I've seen this. For example, there's a funny example of I wanted to dye my hair this color of indigo blue a few years ago. And then I saw my time twin in Seattle. She was in town for a moment. We had lunch together and I show up and I hadn't seen her face in a while because she doesn't update her social media with her own picture very often. And she had the exact color of blue in her hair that I had wanted to dye in mine. And I'm like, oh, that's why I didn't do it, because you did it for me. And so you're living out the prismatic reality of someone in our time cohort having that hair color. Like I felt the desire to do it, but she pulled the trigger. And then in the other direction, person born a day before me also is interested in the same kinds of weird astrology topics that I'm into. And I'm kind of like, how much is my interest in these things mine? Or am I just expressing the chart and I attach this, desire-based ego onto it, or somehow like, oh, I like these things. And it's like, well, what if someone born the day was born just happened to like this stuff?
Right. No, that's so fascinating. I haven't explored that idea of, I mean, I've thought about, for whom was I like the progressed twin, like who was born 10 years before me, that then like when they were 10, I was born, and like the suns were the
Yeah.
same. And there's this, I don't know, there's all these ways that our blood is the same, or like our star blood is the same. And yeah, like what you're saying about preferences, who knows, like these things that I didn't take up, or these paths that I didn't take, somebody else got to take them. And maybe that's what we actually mean by timelines.
Right. Like it doesn't need another alternate universe. It can literally just be your time twin somewhere else is dyeing their hair blue and you're not,
Yeah.
It's like, but I could have done it and maybe then she wouldn't have, you know what I mean?
Well, yeah, and if you don't know them, it kind of is like a parallel universe, like these things do happen in parallel. I mean, it's funny, like I think sometimes about how our experience of any place is so contingent on like the places that we go and the people that we know. When I come to Chicago, I have my spots and I go to these places. And meanwhile, there's maybe just next door to my spot, there's another spot with a whole different kind of vibe and different people. And I would have no idea. And these worlds are all happening really in parallel. And I don't think it's wrong to think of those as parallel universes, or these kinds of like maybe there's a time twin of me in that space that is playing out some life that I didn't get to, or didn't need to, didn't choose to live.
Yeah. And you have to actually stay parallel because if you meet, there's this weird elision or breakdown or sort of like reality gaping hole of like, oh, this is how it really works. Like, I'm not actually me. I'm just
Maybe.
this wavelength of energy and electromagnetic pulsing.
I don't know about that.
Taking it too far. Okay. So let's go back to basics. If someone were going to get into astrology, where would you point them? How would you bring them on, with books or more than books?
Well, if people like books, I think that Astrology and the Authentic Self by Demetra George is a really great place to start, just because of where in the sort of contemporary world of astrology that sits in like the late 2000s, when she's integrating a lot of the traditional material, or I should say the Hellenistic material, and speaking with and counter to the sort of modern norms. And so I think that folks who encounter a lot of, modern rulerships, it's just easy to come across a lot of the modern material that she's citing, but also offering alternatives to. So I think that's a really good place for people to start. And she really breaks down like the anatomy of the birth chart. And that would be the main like beginner, or, beginner intermediate book if you want sort of a lowdown on how to really build the interpretation of a birth chart. And I also love her more recent books, Hellenistic Astrology in Theory and Practice. Volume 1 is just like an immense contribution to what we do. And that's a great place, like after Astrology and the Authentic Self. I'm a big Demetra George fan. I mean, I think most of us are.
Yeah.
But yeah, additionally, I got to start studying astrology with like modern and traditional kind of side by side. But I think that I didn't get to do modern, traditional, and mystical, or like mystery traditions side by side. And that's where my work is right now, is in the mystery tradition, and specifically the Orphic tradition. And so I am continuously offering some education on the Orphic Hymns with Kristen Mathis, and also putting the Orphic Hymns and the material within them in conversation with what we do know about ancient astrology. And back to our conversation about life and death, what that is really sparking in me is this interest in the birth chart, not only as a map of the life, but a map of the soul, a map of life and death, a map of life and the afterlife. And so that's what the Orphics are really interested in, is the afterlife. And so I think that following the journey of the soul and being interested in the soul is a great way to go. So you can follow my work on that by checking out all my stuff.
And where can people find you?
You can find me on Instagram at Anthrosophist, which is ANTHROSOPHIST. And my website is archeastrology.com. That's ARCHE astrology.com. Sometimes people pronounce it arche, and that kind of is like, like I know. And so even my people who know Greek, and I'm like, come on. But yeah, there was something else I wanted to say about that afterlife thing. Oh, I just find it interesting that within what we call the traditional revival of the last 30 years, and I know that's kind of a misnomer, but there's been this push against the sort of soul discourse of evolutionary astrology primarily. And I think that it's time to take that seriously, like not necessarily in the terms of EA, but to take the soul up again as a place to invest our energy, because that's where the bonds are loosed. That's where fate can get untangled, and the investments that we have, the complicated investments and the knotted investments that we have coming into life, that's where all of the good stuff, that's where it all happens. So that's what I'm exploring in my work now. And I hope that people who feel that call can find me. And Kristen.
Yes. Well, thank you for being here and sharing all of your wisdom and helping to take up space with the soul and with the poetic roots of astrology that challenge us more than the simple translation of an ancient astrological textbook. I mean, there's something really amazing happening with what you and Kristen are both doing with this return to seeing alternative forms of knowing embedded in something that is given short shrift. You're talking about this kind of richer, more viscous experience of the roots of astrology that's beyond the simple idea of this mental, as you were speaking to the air transition as well, this kind of like mental, logical translation of Greek into English. You're talking about this other resuscitation of a different, more neglected area of human knowledge, because, you know, poetry and poetics and that idea of fiction is always relegated to the non-factual and therefore non-prized. Right. And yet what I hope people see when they begin to explore your work, and everybody stop and go look at Drew's work, is that idea of the ways of knowing that are embedded in these poetic expressions that are just as valid as the ways of knowing that are embedded in more factual documentation or practical, here's how you loosen the bond and here's how you do this or the other thing. It's like the lessons there in the ways that humans are being they're just so powerful. So thank you for doing that work.
Oh yeah, I mean, thank you for listening and being present for it.
Yes. Thank you, Drew. Thank you for listening to Within Orb. To learn more about the Celestial Arts Education Library, or to become a member, visit our website at CAELi.institute. That's www.caeli.institute. If you enjoyed this episode, please help spread the word. Follow or subscribe to Within Orb in your podcatcher of choice, rate it 5 stars, or write us a happy review. This helps others find the show. We also want to give a big thanks to the indie band The E-Block for contributing their song Wake Up for our intro and outro music. You can find them at their website, eblockband.com. This is Jen's Art, signing off for now. See you next time.